Welcome to episode 101 of Rubbish Talk with me, Alasdair.
And me, Jane Bond.
So we're gonna follow on from last week. We got right up to the 1970s. So we're going to head on into the 1980s. Jane and I are both alive by this point, so hopefully we'll be in slightly stronger ground. We're not going on memories and research. So what was the big things in the 1980s, Jane? What was happening in the big bad world?
1980s, that was like, was that not, 1980s was when, there's Live Aid. I mean, that goes without saying, Live Aid 1985. I remember sitting in, get a black and white telly, sitting in bed watching Live Aid 1985. Oh, those are the days. Anyway, sorry. So Thatcher government, Did you see
a black and white telly?
Yeah.
So when did you get a colour one, Jane?
Well, we did have a colour one, but Mum and Dad had that one, so they weren't really interested that much in Live Aid. So I had a little black and white portable telly in my bedroom.
Well, I never had a television all the years I was growing up.
Oh my goodness! I didn't manage. You didn't watch Live Aid?
Okay. No, never had a television. We never had a television in the house. In fact, my mum still does not have a television.
My goodness! Wow.
There you go.
Okay, yeah. So it was rah-rah skirts and leg warmers as well. We had more reliance on landfill. Falklands War, 1982. Crikey. Miners' strike, 84 to 85. That was a big one. Miners' strike. There's quite a lot happening, actually, in terms of what was happening in the world. There's a fall of the Berlin Wall, happened in 1989. So there is more environmental legislation coming through again. So it was the 1988, I hadn't actually realised this, was the Environmental Protection Act, and the Environmental Protection 1990 was introduced to the UK Parliament on 89 and received royal assent in 1990. I always go Environmental Protection Act 1990. I didn't really think about how it was went through.
I disappeared down a bit of a rabbit hole when I was putting the notes together, because I found this thing, the Environment and Safety Information Act 1988, which was seemingly the sort of precursor to getting the Environmental Protection Act. And it was all to do with local authorities maintaining public registers of enforcement notices relating to environmental health and safety regulations. So I never knew that before. Every day is a school day, Jane.
Absolutely. In 1988 was when I first started working for a consultant, and that was when I started getting into landfill. This is what you said to me, nobody wants to work and nobody goes into landfill, but you see, my degree subject was the role of the geologist in the landfilling of waste. And then I went into a consultant and worked on landfill, and then I actually moved to 1990 was when I was doing my MSc in pollution control. That was when I have affinity for the Environmental Protection Act 1990.
Well, the 1980s, I was probably, the only connection I had with waste management was probably being fascinated by the operation of the refuse collection vehicle that came around once a week to collect your waste. And I was always fascinated by the compaction equipment in the back of the vehicle. And it was probably done at that time with black sacks rather than bins at the time, if I remember correctly. So
yeah,
there you go. So what was the big big things that were happening? Special regulations, 1981 was put in place, and that replaced the Poisonous Waste Act 1972. No, I'm not quite sure why. I think it was viewed that the 1972 Act was working reasonably well. I think they just wanted to tighten things up. Introduction of wheelie bins in the early 1980s, and I believe Dunfermline was one of the first local authorities, which with Fife Council now, was one of the first to introduce. And by introducing wheelie bins, you effectively gave the public more space, and you didn't have to carry your waste to the curbside. So basically, people managed to produce more waste, and they reckoned that it increased the amount of waste produced by 20% just by giving increased capacity. And it's quite interesting now we're trying to reduce capacity in residual bins to try and drive that towards recycle it. We had bottle banks would start appearing in supermarket car parks and so on. And the big thing was obviously the it was Thatcher government in place, and they were introducing what they call compulsory competitive tendering. So that meant that councils effectively had to tender for their own waste collection they were doing. And it was to try, and the logic was it was trying to make them a bit more efficient in terms of the collection. And the landfill directive, so we were in the EEC at the time, and they were pushing the landfill directive. So by this time, we were very reliant on landfill, whereas lots of Europe wasn't particularly reliant on landfill. So they were pushing the UK to try to conform to their landfill directive. So it was time of quite significant change for the waste sector.
Yeah, it certainly was. I think the CCT, the compulsory competitive tendering, was quite a change in looking at service delivery and cost structures, and it kind of introduced quite a lot of outsourcing at that point as well, which was good in a way, but not so good in another way. And we were largely landfill dilute and disperse sites. So the 1980s was really the first start of the linear, really strong linear economy where everybody was buying things. People used to rent things previously, but 1980s everybody was buying all their home equipment and all of this sort of stuff. You didn't rent your telly anymore, you bought it towards the end of the 80s. So we were getting a lot more waste as well. So certainly was making a difference. That was the start of it. And then we get into
But it was still, I was going to say, Jane, it was still very much, the 1980s was still very much, it's not nearly as consumerist as now.
No,
I remember being sent to the greengrocer to buy fruit and veg, and I'd have the string bag, and all the veg would be put into the bag just with no wrapping, no nothing.
That's true.
But it was very much, it was the time where, the fancy greengrocer shop would open where you could go and pick your own, and you could put your own stuff into a plastic bag and so on. It was very much that period. Interesting, another one that my recollection of this time was my father worked for a company called BXL at Grangemouth, and BXL basically made the nurdles for plastic. And it was very much viewed at that time as being the modern industry that was going to save the world, because it was going to improve packaging. It was very much sold on that basis at the time, and think of all the problems that we're perceiving plastic to have caused now.
Well, yeah, what's a nurdle?
Is that not what you call the wee plastic nurdles you get?
I don't know.
The nurdles. You know it. Come on, you must have had a nurdle.
What a nurdle is. I don't know what a nurdle is.
Is that what it's called? I'm going to have to, while you're talking, I'm going to have to Google this to make sure I'm...
Yeah, this is definitely some Alasdair
That's how they extrude... That's not a Scottish word. That's how they make plastic. They get all these plastic nurdles and extrude it into whatever product you want to make.
Right, like kind of pellets of plastics.
That's the one. I'm sure they're called nurdles. Have I just totally made that up?
Yeah, I think so. So the 1980s, informative periods. That was just on from there. That was my university years. So I was not too worried about waste collection at that point until we get into the landfill side. So then we start from the 1980s. Well, Alasdair finds out what a nurdle is. We start going on to the 1990s.
I found out what they are. Nurdles are tiny, roughly 2 to 5 millimetre, lentil-shaped plastic pellets that serve as the raw material for nearly all plastic production.
Okay, that's a
Every
nurdle.
day's a school day, Jane.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going on to. I'm moving on to the next. So, what's your remembrance of the 1990s?
Oh, did I remember the 90s? So I would have. So
is that your university career?
That would have been no, I'm just getting my dates right. My university was late 80s. So my university was then. So 1990s was my first job at Shanks McEwen. But the big things that period was the fall of Margaret Thatcher in 1990, death of Princess Diana 1997.
Oh, I remember where I was then.
I remember quite vividly where I was then, actually. I was at home, actually. Good Friday Agreement 1998. And the one that got me a wee bit was the launch of the Channel Tunnel, 1994.
Crikey.
It took them about 10 years to build, so it's like, and you think that's all recent, but that's all 30 years ago.
I know, this is a bit where we think everything's quite recent, because 1990 I was working for Shropshire County Council, and
Wow.
as everybody would know if they'd listened to episode 12. So I was working for Shropshire County Council, and then went on to do an MSc, and then I went travelling for a while and was looking at landfill liners over in the States, because we'd only really just started with lining landfill sites, late 1980s, 1990s. A lot of it was using clay, and I remember all sorts of different things that they were using to line landfill sites, because they were using clay, which was, good stuff. We could measure the permeability of the clay and the thickness. And then there was a use of, one landfill site was using tarmac to line the landfill site. They were using tarmac. And then this is where it started into bentonite and rich sand as well. So sort of clay, you would add in bentonite into sand, and that would make quite an impermeable material that you could actually, again, line landfill sites with. And then introduction of synthetic liners, high density polyethylene liners. And this is where, it all really, really only just started. So that's what I went to America for, and did a bit of a study tour around America, looking at plastic liners and how it was lined and how it was made and all of this sort of stuff. So it's very interesting. Well, I thought it was at the time. So, but this is the start of working, and everything was landfill. We had the 1990 duty of care, EPA. That was mother of all legislation in my eyes at that time. So we had landfill tax. 1996, landfill tax introduced, and that was very significant fiscal measure, again, trying to move waste away from landfill sites, but try and recycle, reuse. This is where you get your curbside recycling schemes expanded. So it was actually quite a big era in terms of environmental legislation and things that were happening. So, yeah.
I think my memory of so I joined the industry in 1990s, and I remember the one that puts in real stark contrast to me was the landfill site that Shanks McEwen run at Aberdeen. It was a site called Black Dog landfill site, and it was literally, it's a former sand and gravel quarry. So you had the sand and gravel quarry, you had the sand dunes, and then you had a beautiful beach that stretched all the way back into Aberdeen, and then you had the North Sea. And this was basically a classic dilute and disperse site where the rain would fall on it and it'd wash the stuff into the sand. And the rumour was the helicopter pilots used to call it the Shanks and McEwen oil slick that sat 2 miles offshore. So whatever was put into that landfill site would appear back out into the ocean a few months later, sort of thing. So that site, when I started, that site was just been in the process of being closed down. And Shanks and McEwen had built a site at Tarbert Hill, and it was using cutting edge technology, which was 2 millimeter high density polyethylene liner. But it was placed straight on top of sand because it was a former sand quarry. And the challenge was you could puncture the thing really easily. So although it was totally lined when you built it, once you put your waste in it, it wasn't totally lined. So whereas now the spec is your HDP and then your clay as a protection. But the really ironic thing for me was what they would do at that site was you'd obviously produce quite a lot of leachate. So they'd come along with the tankers, pick it up at the tanker, take it up to Peterhead, and it used to go out in the long sea outfall into the North Sea. So it wasn't really
Yeah.
In theory, it was an improvement, but in reality, it was just a circle. So thankfully, we're hopefully past that type of thing where, it was almost paying lip service to the regulations. So
yeah, I think the 1990s as well, working for Shropshire County Council, and we were doing a lot of groundwater monitoring boreholes, gas monitoring boreholes, all the capping sites as well. And for me, I think we were quite ahead of the game. The Environment Agency and SEPA were developed in just before 1996, so early 96, and I moved up to Scotland in November 1996. So I'd gone from Shropshire County Council, where we were doing a lot of lining, testing, all of that sort of stuff, and I moved into consultancy, and I worked on quite a lot of landfills up in Scotland, and went, oh, not quite the same containment and regulatory and standard of what it had been like further south. So that was quite an eye-opener for me.
Yeah, it's a similar story. Like Shanks McEwen had, so they were a Scottish company that was born out of the Clydesdale Steelworks. So
All right.
they took the clinker and recovered the metal, and that's how they were born, and that's how they started getting involved in landfill, because they were disposing of the clinker. And but they were quite a rich company, and they're quite a profitable company, and they bought. Obviously, Clydesdale Steelworks was shutting down, so they needed to diversify. They diversified into landfill in Scotland, but they also bought what was called London Brick Company. So all these big clay pits outside London, where they extracted the clay to make bricks to build all the houses, they were then filling them back out of waste. So they were quite far advanced in terms of their landfill technology. So the site would already be clay, so it was really well lined already naturally. But they were the sort of pioneers of the landfill gas extraction as well. Basically, Shanks sort of learnt off the back of, I think that area, around London was probably quite far in advance of other areas in terms of their landfill and their design and so on. And that sort of developed through the 1990s into the early 2000s. So with the level of landfill went up and up and up, partly because of the landfill directive coming in.
Yeah, I think that's where we started looking at extracting landfill gas as well, and pumping trials. It was never at that point, although I'm thinking early 90s now, it was never at that point looking at gas extraction for electricity generation as such, but it was more about controlling gas migration. Because I think it was round about that time or earlier where there'd been that Losco explosion, landfill gas explosion in a bungalow because of the movement of methane gas from the landfill sites. So that's kind of again where we started to look at extracting landfill gas and that kind of thing. So there's a lot happening then. I think the landfill tax was quite an important thing as well.
One of the first sites I used to look after was just outside, I'll not mention it, outside Glasgow, and it did have a landfill gas migration problem. And we spent years and years trying to find out what was causing that. But the actual landfill gas flare was literally like a large Bunsen burner you used to get in your classroom. And you literally lit it. You got a stick, you wrapped an oil rag round the end, you lit the oil rag, and then you held it up to the Bunsen burner to light your flare. That's how they were.
No health and safety there.
It was that primitive. So in terms of what was going on, sort of waste management wise, it was very much for local authorities. They had to separate out because there were more private companies involved in waste. So though councils had generally held on through the competitive tendering, they'd held on to the public collection, if you like, as in going around to households. There was sort of commercial pressure on them actually delivering the same service to commercial businesses, and they had to separate that out to make it fair, so they weren't, being unfair in terms of their competition with commercial waste. We had the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and the UK ultimately accepts the EU landfill directive. I think we did that fairly grudgingly because I think we thought our landfill technology was quite good at the time, and it probably was in some ways, listening to the rest of Europe. Landfill tax concept was started off, and that eventually happened in 1996, and that was really to promote, make it more viable to actually recycle the waste. Big change in Scotland was the 1996 local government reorganisation, which created the new unitary authorities as we know them now. And that was interesting. Certainly for me, that was interesting. When one of my first contracts was for East Ayrshire, and unknown to me, East Ayrshire still operated as Kilmarnock and Loudon and Cumnock and Doon Valley district councils. And they never actually really, although they would write to you as East Ayrshire, they effectively operated as two separate local authorities. And that was years after the transfer. And then the establishment of Caledon and Shanks Centre, which we'll come on to in a bit. And SEPA was started in 96, and I remember it well because I opened a landfill site on March or 1st of April 1996, and SEPA was also born on the 1st of April 1996, so that was an interesting time. And then the 1997, the replacement for compulsory competitive tendering was brought out. So that was the big changes that were going on in the sector at the time.
We also had this is as well, the landfill tax. And this is quite interesting actually, because you look back at it and it was a tax for landfill, and it was trying to push landfill, trying to increase recycling, really push away from landfill tax. And the standard rate in those days, 1996, it started off at £7 per tonne for active waste, so domestic waste, that sort of thing, and the lower rate of £2 per tonne for inactive or inert waste. And that's like, and now it's up to, what was it, up to £126.15 per tonne and £4.05 for the inert waste. It's just like the difference is quite stark. And again, the set to increase up to £130 now, £130.75 from 1st of April 2026. Yeah, so it's quite an increase, and I think that is one of the things that's really changed the climate of waste management as well. Increased all our recycling and all of that sort of stuff. It's made a big difference. We also had, my other thing is the ADR regulations, which is to do with transport of dangerous goods on the road, and they were introduced in 1996 as well. That made it compulsory, loads of legislation, regulation about dangerous goods on the road, of which some types of waste are part of, similar batteries, clinical waste. So they don't not only come against the waste legislation, but also against the carriage of dangerous goods by road regulations, which enacts the ADR. So yeah, that's quite important. Anything else?
I think I've told this story before, but when I was running Bar Environmental, when the landfill tax came in, the lower rate tax material just simply vanished. So all the material you would use for, you get the brick and rubble and, farmer demolishing a shed, somebody digging up a field, doing whatever. So you'd use the hard stuff you would use for your roads, the soil stuff you would use for your landfill cover. And literally when the tax came in, that material just vanished. And it still amazes me when you look at the HMRC and the Revenue Scotland figures that a quarter of what is disposed in landfills is seemingly inert waste. Is just, I can't quite get my head around why that may be. But the cynic in me says there's a reason for that, and it's not really inert waste. But that's maybe a different story. Oh, the big changes at the time, I mentioned that earlier on, was the local government reorganisation. So all our East Ayrshire, South Ayrshire, North Ayrshire, all these different authorities were often a number of district councils. Like I said, Cumnock and Doon Valley was joined with Camarca and Loudoun, but they still very much initially operated as independent. And I think you'll probably still find some of those people still view themselves as Cumnock and Doon Valley rather than East Ayrshire. So it takes a long, long time for these things to come out. I talked about the creation of SEPA, so that was a joining together of the River Purification Board's council waste regulation function. So the councils had this dubious joy of they were allowed to operate the sites, but they were also allowed to regulate themselves, which caused some interesting scenarios. And again, if you want a bit more detail on that, have a look at John Crawford's post, because he's got some quite interesting anecdotes about that. So councils could actually regulate themselves. Some private companies would say they never regulated themselves hard enough. And sometimes if they did try and regulate themselves, they were told to go and take a run and jump by other people in the council. So SEPA was to try and put everything under the one body. The other thing that went into SEPA, the hazardous waste team, there was another team that was part of Scottish Government at the time, which I'll do a bit Googling while we talk on and find out what that was. But that was the basis of SEPA, that they were meant to combine all these local authority people. So people that work for councils were two-peat across, river purification people were two-peat across, and it was meant to be this all-encompassing environmental body that would look at, water, air, land, all the environmental issues all under one roof. So started off with great intentions. Almost 30 years later, do you realise it's going to be their 30-year anniversary this year, Jane? Did you work that one out?
And the Environment Agency as well. Yeah.
Well, I'm not quite sure if was the Environment Agency the same time?
Yeah, Environment Agency,
Were they
1st of April
formed in
1996. Yeah,
was
because
it? Yeah, you
I
got
was working for the council then, and we all moved into the Environment Agency, and we stayed in our little council huts for a while, and then we moved out to the Severn Trent building because we merged with the Severn Trent Water Authority, and so we all moved into the same building and made us into the Environment Agency. So it certainly changed things there.
so. Right, so 1994, we had the waste management license and regulations introduced, and this was where something that I've since that period worked quite extensively on. So if you're working in the waste industry before the 10th of August 1994, and if you'd applied to an organisation called Waste Management Industry Training and Advisory Board, as in WAMATAB, for a certificate of technical competence, and if in that time, 12-month period, you'd be acting as a manager of a facility, then you were basically provided a temporary certificate till the 10th of August 1999. So when this all came out, when I remember being at Shanks, I was certainly not managing a site, but I was put forward as the technical competent manager for a number of sites, and I received my, if you like, a provisional certificate of technical competence, which meant I was okay to run landfill sites up until the 10th of August 1999, which is what I pretty much did. And they also had a sort of grandfather rights that if you were 55 or over on 10th of August 1994, in the 10 years ending on that date, and you had at least 5 years experience of managing facility, then you had until the 10th of August 2004 to actually retire and get out of the sector. And that was what they call grandfather rights. So there were still people, in the late 2011, the number of people I'd still come across that were still claiming they had grandfather rights when their grandfather rights had expired years later. So my provisional certificate lasted till the 10th of August 1999, and after that point I had to make sure I formally did the qualification and got a proper qualification. Quite sad to say I've been involved in the WAMATAB qualifications since that time. So
you're not a grandfather anymore, Alasdair?
I'm not a grandfather rights. I've not got provisional anymore. I've got the full thing, and that was all built into the Waste Management Licence and Regs 1994. An important part of legislation for me, anyway.
It certainly was. I think we're going to go a little bit into date order, because there's the Caledonian Shank Centre. That was 1991-92, and then into 1996. So I'm going to let you do that one, Alasdair, as well, because you know a bit more about that one. And then we'll go on to later on.
So this was 1991-92 was very much the start of my Shanks days, and there was Ken Morn was the MD of Shanks, and what his idea was, there was probably quite a lot of pressure on waste companies to, improve their standards, do more research, and Shanks was sort of fairly proactive in that. So they contacted University of Strathclyde with a view to Shanks providing funding for 5 years for a chair in waste management. At the time, the Professor McGowan, who was chair of the civil engineering department at the University of Strathclyde, was very receptive, and he was quite keen. Unfortunately, Professor McGowan was due to retire, and a new chair was going to take place, could come forward, and that was a gentleman by the name Professor Fleming. Now, Professor Fleming had a sideline of doing a bit of consultancy for landfill sites. One of them, ironically, was Auchencarrick landfill site, which, when I worked at Bar, was ultimately bought from the owner, and I ended up running that one. And the other one I remember going around in my student days was the site at Inverclyde, and that was one of Professor Fleming's. He charged lots of money, or I assume he charged lots of money for doing all the engineering design. It was a hard rock quarry. He'd put stone gabions all the way around the perimeter, and they had a hell of a problem actually managing the site because it was pulling in so much oxygen. The site was overheating. There was all sorts of issues with the site, and that was one of his favourite ones. So he wasn't particularly keen on this chair of waste management because he thought it might impact on his consultancy business. So it took another 5 years before Shanks McEwan revisited the idea. They spoke to Professor Jim Baird at Glasgow Caledonian University, and they managed to set up a chair in waste management and they called it the Caledonian Shanks Centre. And that was really to look at new ways of improving waste recycling in Scotland. And that was actually funded by the landfill tax credits. So when you had a landfill site and you charged tax, you were allowed to put a portion of these funds into an environmental body, and that allowed a bit of money to go from Shanks McEwan into Glasgow Caledonian Shanks Centre to fund the Shanks Centre. And that was probably my first sort of knowledge of, people doing good research into waste management and looking at participation rates. I remember working with Caledonian Shanks Centre about, just basically trying to put together a waste analysis protocol, because up to that point there was no standard way of doing a waste analysis for waste management, and how you can make results consistent across various waste analysis jobs.
Yeah, I think it was really important to do all that legislation and not all the research made a big difference. So that was pretty important. We're just going to very briefly touch on a couple of other things before we head into the 2000s. So in 1997, we replaced the competitive tendering legislation with best value. So where councils had to demonstrate the cost of delivering their in-house services were comparable with private sector operations. So basically that kind of made in-house operations a bit more viable, rather than having to put everything out to tender all the time. And then the modern...
They don't still need to do this. Do they still need to do this now?
Well, put things out to tender.
Do they need to even do best value? No, the best value. Do they still need to do that?
I don't know. I think there was a big...
The local authority person to let us know.
Because there was a big thing a while ago where they had to look at their... make sure that they still delivered, best value in-house. But whether it was called best value or not, I don't know. The other thing was, just briefly, modern Scottish Parliament was formed on the 12th of May 1999. So this is where we start getting separate Scottish legislation, because it was devolved legislation, particularly in the environment. So this is where we start getting specific Scottish legislation rather than UK regulations for the environment side of it. So there we go. It was a brief, well, actually, it wasn't very brief run through the 90s with reminiscing from myself and Alasdair.
Yep, absolutely. And then we're into the 2000s. So bear in mind, here's a question for you, Jane. Up until this point, did you have a mobile phone or a laptop?
Well, what's interesting, right? When I was working for the county council in Shrewsbury in Shropshire, we had a car phone. So if we were going out doing loan work, we had this massive car phone
like a wee
thing.
suitcase.
Yeah. But we also we didn't have laptops, but we had desktops. So we all had desktops. When I moved to Scotland in 1996, I worked for Babty Group. I remember walking in there and I was like, where's the computers? You had to share a computer, like one between three, which was quite a shock. So I didn't have a laptop at that point, but only just had a share of a desktop computer.
Yeah, I was interested because the Shanks, when my Shanks been up to 96, I think. So I had a laptop, but the laptop was the size of a suitcase. And I only used it for doing the data. And I was actually one of the people on the site that had a small mobile phone, because I was a lone worker at the time, and that was my thingy. So I did actually have one at the thingy. But then when I went to bar, I had no computer and no phone at bar. And that was right up till 2002. So early 2000s, big changes. So 9/11 attacks in America, 2001. I remember quite vividly being. I was up.
Me too.
You remember where you were?
Absolutely. Lewis was only about 18 months old at that time, and we were in Popinol in Spain, and so we heard. Oh no, sorry, France. Sorry, the French-Spanish border. We heard it there, and coming home. When we were coming home, we came home through London, and there was snipers everywhere. and it took hours to get through. And, you know, Lewis wasn't very old, so he was wanting food and they wouldn't let me take baby bag through. And oh my God. But yes, I remember it quite well.
So I was at a place called Hamilton Waste, and I remember actually, we must have had, so on the computers, I was able to watch it on a computer, which was quite sort of new at the time. But I remember one of the other things with Hamilton Waste, I remember there was a young graduate that was working there, and he actually introduced me to Google. I had no clue what Google was at the time, and the fact that you just put someone into a search engine and search for it, that was my first knowledge of Google. And again, I never had a laptop or a computer, that business. I was very much, working pen and paper. So what else was happening? 7/7 bombings in London, 2005. Biggie was the biggie. Well, the biggie I think is important was the smoking ban. So that was in Scotland. It was introduced first 26th of March 2006, followed by Wales, Northern Ireland, April 2007. England eventually got their act together 1st of July 2007. And I always think back to this thing. We seem to just want to consult people about everything. And I think back to that smoking ban. It went on for ages and ages and ages, saying all these poor smokers, etc., etc. The vast majority of the population actually wanted the smoking ban and welcomed the smoking ban. But the small minority was able to sort of push their sort of agenda. And I think most people, when you go abroad and there's not a smoking ban, you suddenly realise how beneficial it is. So I think there's probably a bit of, if somebody does a bit of research about how the small minority can be really vocal and keep the status quo or keep their agenda in place, it would probably help some of the environmental legislation. So 2008 financial crisis, I remember that quite well because I was actually in Romania and Bulgaria doing a business tour when I was working for the Albion, and I can remember being told that you were only guaranteed in your bank account a certain amount of money and frantically moving money around to make sure I had the guarantees. In London, the other one, which I never knew, was 2005, was when London won the bid to host the Olympics in 2012.
Big things happening. What
was happening in the world of waste?
Well, had National Waste Strategy for Scotland was developed, which was quite interesting because I was actually working for Babty, which merged into Jacobs American company. But when it was Babty's, we were working on some of the waste strategies for Highland and Moray, and I was working with Colin Clark from Highland Council at the time, and this was late 2000s. We were working on that, and nothing changed. I think we've said before that Scotland is brilliant at policies and strategies, but implementation is something a little bit different. So that was our waste strategy. There was actually waste SEPA, and the councils were actually involved and had their own waste strategy groups and developed all sorts of things as well, which again kind of got swept under the carpet, but that's another story. The Strategic Waste Fund was introduced, major expansion of curbside recycling, so that was quite significant. This is a bit where you extend your curbside recycling and actually recycling rate rises. So it rose from 5% in 2000 to around about 45% in 2006. And it's one of those things where, you do all of that big push, it makes a massive change, but nothing changes much more than that. It's difficult to increase or improve too much. I think also there was also quite a lot of ring fencing for their funding for the councils, and then for some reason they decided to remove that ring fencing and just say, right, instead of giving it and ring fencing it to waste, we give it to councils to spend on waste, but not actually ring fence it to waste. So interesting. Was this a Zero Waste Scotland started up in the 90s? When did Zero Waste Scotland start? Was that 2000s? I think it was.
About 2009, 2010, yeah.
Was it that late?
Yeah.
So
I remember
it's all been going.
It was initially through RAP, so remember the waste resource action program was set up down south to look at some of the challenges in the waste sector, and then there was I feel like a Scottish version of RAP operated in Scotland for 2 or 3 years. and then that was eventually formed into Zero Waste Scotland. I'm not totally sure of all the dates and so on.
Because this is where they had RAG as well, wasn't it? The Recycling Action Group. And that,
Yep.
Yeah, and that was part of Caledonian Shanks Centre as well. They were working together, and there was quite a lot of publicity, quite a lot of communications around it at that point as well. So so it was quite.
It's
a lot
actually
happening.
quite, when you see that, Jane, it's actually quite sad to think about. So the recycling rate rose to about 45% in 2006. 20 years later, we've actually not really made that big not made that big an improvement in that. So for 20 years, we've been moving the shapes around the board and not really achieving very much, which is a fairly sad indictment. And
I think there was quite a big push in that era as well.
Yeah, I think the ring fence and the funding, the move to the separate bins, so you could separate, but that focus. You had the landfill tax driving waste away from landfill. You had the increase in the recycling going on. You had sort of ring fence funding going into local authorities, so they could actually target it. And there was I would suggest there was really good stuff coming out of the Caledonian Environment Centre in terms of what best practice looked like, and councils could pick up and run with that. So it was probably, I think, in terms of making big changes, it was probably the heyday of the waste sector to a certain extent, and that early 2000 period in terms of big strategic changes. So the big one, I remember the National Waste Strategy, that SEPA managed that, if you like, and they set up different groups, if you like, to try and make it strategic. It was around this time the big challenge for waste companies and councils was actually to get planning permission for facilities, because there were sort of bad neighbour developments. Quite often it was a real challenge to get planning permissions in place, so there was a real push to make sure councils allocated waste management facility areas in their area. And as we talked about, the Strategic Waste Fund, the Challenge Fund, was very much ring fence for vehicles, recycling infrastructure, and staffing levels for councils to develop. And quite often, a lot of the senior waste management officers I know, or colleagues in the area, came up through that rank of being a recycling officer and then worked up through the system and understand that. But I think there was then a period of time where they were getting snaffled up into Zero Waste Scotland, and within a few years they were losing that sort of operational context, which I think is really easy to say we should do this and this. To actually go to a householder and tell the householder to do that, it's a different story. So there was very much the recycling officers learnt the hard way about what would work and what wouldn't work. That's where we were in the early 2000s.
Yeah. So what about 2010 to 2020? Where did we get to there?
More policy, Jane.
More policy. Oh, absolutely. So we had a circular economy that started, that wording started in 2015. What is a circular economy? And, lots of people still don't understand what that means. So we were doing all our make, take, use, dispose of then, linear economy, and now we're getting more into there. People are realising that perhaps throwing stuff away isn't quite such a good idea after all. We had the Blue Planet, and that was massive, wasn't it, on plastics? Identified the amount of plastics.
I can't believe that was 8 years ago. 8 years ago.
The amount of plastics in, the sea and all of that sort of stuff. And microplastics started coming in there. We had a net zero commitment, which said we're going to, commit to net zero by 2050, all sorts of stuff. And then one of the big ones was China. They decided they weren't going to take in any recycling plastics and things like that. And that was a big impact on recycling exports. So things had to be dealt with in-house or try and circumvent the China route. It was quite a time.
Was it not China trying to tighten up? And my understanding of the National Sword was they were getting sent lots of crap they shouldn't have been doing. It was to try and tighten up in the standard of the stuff they were getting.
But I think they did close their doors to a lot of stuff as well.
Enacted in 2018, they drastically banned the import of most plastic and lower grade recycles, setting a 0.5 contamination limit. The policy
which basically stopped it.
24 types of waste, forcing global recycling to get their act together and find a better system.
Yeah.
There you go. So what was happening in the big bad world out there? London Olympics, 2012.
I
remember coming
went
up.
down there.
I never actually went, but I remember
It's good.
driving back up from down south and listening to the opening ceremony and so on. Brexit referendum,
There we go.
2016, a wrong turning for the UK, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Manchester Arena bombing, 2017, Grenfell, 2017, and then, as Jane said, the blue plastic moment and so on. So lots happening in the world, but what was happening? There was very little legislation, I think, in this period, Jane, or very little substantial legislation.
But we did have the establishment of Zero Waste Scotland. That was incorporated November the 2nd, 2012. Whatever you think about him, that's when they were incorporated. And I think one other thing was they did have, and I must admit, because for my sins, I actually got interviewed and got a second interview for the head of Zero Waste Scotland. I'm so glad I didn't kind of go anywhere.
Have I ever confessed? On you go, sorry. I'll confess in a minute once you've confessed.
Yeah, so I'm so glad I didn't go anywhere. But yeah, so, and I think the thing with Zero Waste Scotland, what they did, they came in and, it was going to be the be all and end all. They were going to increase recycle rates, everything was going to happen. And what they did do was they had quite high salaries. So I think what you were saying there, Alasdair, they kind of poached people from local authorities, not so much local authorities, but quite often they poach people from SEPA to work in this policy, and people who'd never actually done any operational experience. So a lot of it was blue sky thinking that didn't necessarily implement on the ground. But what's your...
So the one that what I was going to confess to was the national waste strategy. So how SEPA divided it. So they had a national waste strategy, and then they had regional or area waste strategies. So they appointed little teams to do each one. So I went for an interview for that role. I can't actually remember. I think it was with Bar at the time. And actually, still to this day, I got asked a question that I should have actually put a complaint about. Their advert was very much, they wanted people from the sector, they wanted people from a diverse area and so on to sort of feed into this waste strategy, if you like. And the question I got asked was something to do with being poacher turned gamekeeper, as in to work for a waste company to then work for SEPA. And still to this day, I was like, I should have grumbled about that, but I never did. I never got a job either, which in a way I'm probably quite glad about. And then we go into 2020s, which we're probably not going to go into a lot of detail because
we're nearly there. We're nearly finished.
We're almost there, but it's been a hell of a run. We've had the COVID, we've got all the issues with the PPE, and then the waste industry had to deal with all the disposal issues from all that wasted PPE that was taking up loads of warehouse and time and space. Huge increase in online shopping and packaging waste. You only need to look at the bin system. Like I've talked about this before, I'm sure. My cardboard bin is not sufficient for the amount of packaging you get from Amazon. We've got the Environment Act 2021. We've got extended producer responsibility reforms coming out. We did have the attempt at a deposit return scheme, which might be reappearing. The simpler recycling reforms that are going on down in England at the moment. We've got energy security issues. We've got cost of living issues. And we've got lots and lots of turmoil in the world with what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Iran at the moment. Lots of turbulence and oil price changing, which higher the oil price goes, the better the recycling of the plastic will be.
Yeah.
Look on the bright side.
This is the bit where you need to bring in your history, Alasdair, of should have been in the earlier one about developing Albion Environmental.
Oh, that was 2002. That was
we missed it.
2 decades
we missed
ago.
it.
We missed it.
So totally missed
Albion
it.
was born.
And then I was, because I was thinking 2019, that's when I joined Albion. So, I missed it in the other decade as well. So there we go.
Yeah. If you want to know how Albion was born, go back and listen to episode 1. There you go. I'm sure it's talked. I've not listened to that one for a while, but I'm sure it's talked about in there.
Absolutely.
2002.
So there's lots happening. We're still we're hopefully in our implementation stage, are we? Do you think, Alasdair? Are we still producing strategies and policies, or are we actually getting into the implementation? We did start with our landfill ban, and we did start with the deposit return scheme, but not exactly, didn't exactly get there, does it?
I feel as if after going through all these years there, Jane, when you look back, there were we never talked it right at the way the start the episode 100. We never talked about food waste. Memory from my mum was, food waste was collected, by horse and cart, and it was taken to feed the pigs. That was back in the 1930s, 1940s. And now we introduce food waste collection and think it's something modern, whatever. It's like the whole cycle just keeps going and going and going. And at the moment, I sometimes feel as if we're just moving the pieces around without actually really driving any sort of strategic, important change. But in terms of going through this, the big legislative changes over 100 years, I would say, would be the Clean Air Act 1956. And that the biggest impact was that changed the waste stream. So that stopped people burning the waste of the household. So that changed it from being ash to more volume, which changed the need for different collection vehicles. It changed for the compaction systems and the disposal systems. So that was the first big one.
Yeah, then I think there's a Control of Pollution Act 1974, COPA, and that was the first licensing framework and the first identification that something needed to happen, which led on to the Environmental Protection Act 1990, again, the mother of all legislation. And that introduced duty of care, controlled waste. We've actually got more legislation coming through from that act. The amount of different types of legislation that came through on the back of that act is quite significant. So that's great. That was quite important.
It's quite interesting there. The first one, Clean Air Act, that was very much about public health. For these Control of Pollution Act environment, they're then protecting the environment, if you like. The fourth one, I think, is really important, is landfill tax. That has been such a significant driver in terms of driving stuff towards recycling. It's probably what's driving towards the growth in incineration in the UK. That's really important. And then the fifth one is the EU landfill directive, where we had to raise the game, if you like, in the UK in terms of how we've managed landfills. It did force a lot of waste as landfill became dearer. Both because of the tax and because the improved engineering, that forced a lot of waste away from landfill sites, and then that triggered investment in material recycling facilities, energy from waste facilities, all that type of thing. So that was a big change, and it has changed UK waste policy quite significantly.
Quite significantly, yeah. I mean, that's why we're looking at so much more recycling. We're looking at so much more, starting through the energy from waste side. And in terms of Scotland, we've got obviously there was the Scottish Parliament, and then we've got our Waste Scotland Regulations 2012, which was quite important in terms of recycling behaviour, because we do have different legislation. There are different regulations between Scotland and England. They're not significantly different to some extent, but they're quite important in terms of how we focus on things. So, for instance, we were talking earlier, you said earlier about simple recycling, which is, introduced in England at the moment, and the amount of local authorities there that have said, no, we can't collect food waste, it's too much of a hassle, or we need to, we need to delay it. But, in Scotland, we've been doing it since, 2012 or whatever. And, it's not been a big issue. So it's looking at the devolved nations and how they're doing things. Yeah.
So the way Scotland regs 2012 did change stuff quite considerably in Scotland, but I would argue that some of it has been the least well regulated bit of legislation ever. The fact that commercial businesses need to segregate waste from recycle it just isn't regulated. I was at a couple of places a weekend, I'm not going to mention where it was, and there was no segregation. My son went through Glasgow Airport the other day, and the recycling and the residual waste bin has got different compartments at the top. It all leads to the one plastic bag. So
God.
it's not being
Yeah.
it's not being segregated. So it's like, we do bits of things and then we don't follow through. So in terms of just a real brief summary in terms of Scotland be the rest of the UK, has it been that different, or we're all going the same direction? So before devolution, waste in Scotland was largely UK-driven legislation. Scotland implemented things through the Scottish Office. The big change for Scotland, I suppose, was the creation of SEPA in '96, as we talked about earlier on.
And then we get into post-1999, Scottish Parliament established. We had increasing divergence because we have earlier food waste separations, 2012, more prescriptive recycling rules. We had an earlier biodegradable landfill ban. We had
which
quite
never
a
quite
few,
happened.
which never quite happened. But the idea was there. In theory, we've had a stronger waste narrative. I mean, we're talking about lots of enabling things. It's the implementation. We had a separate DRS approach, and again, that didn't quite get there, but hopefully 2027. So, that's the Scottish focus. And again, we've got England, what's been happening there.
Certainly, it appears that, when you see what's going on, I think some authorities down south have been quite proactive about the separate collection, but I think some have been sort of sitting back and waiting. So they've been slow to move in mandatory separation, and there's been a big reliance on market mechanisms to do that. And the big change is the Environment Act 2021, which is currently driving the big reform at the moment in terms of simpler recycling and so on. And in Wales, as we had Andy on, an aggressive recycling target. They've got high performing curbside separation systems, so they've taken a really different approach from the rest of the UK, but seem to be figures dictate at the moment that they're one of the top recycling countries in the world, not just in the UK. So that policy seems to have been working for them.
So, how do we sum up the last 100 years, Alasdair? 1950s to 1990s. We regulated waste to stop it harming people. A lot of that was based around health. And then 1990s to 2000s, we then moved on to stop it harming the environment after we'd had our Blue Planet stuff. And then 2010s to 20, regulating waste to protect resources and cut carbon. So those are the summing up, really. I think it's...
Yeah.
Now, all of them, we can tick all those boxes and say, yeah, that's a good reason to regulate. It's just let's, make it work.
I think some things now we seem to forget about that. The fundamental purpose of waste management is not to cause harm to people.
Yes.
And I think definitely in the developing world, that is often totally missed. There's a focus on resources, focus on carbon, and ultimately, you should not be harming people in the first place, and then think about the environment and so on. So hopefully, in the last 2 episodes, we've not totally destroyed the last 100 years of waste management in the UK and Scotland. If you want a more sensible read of some anecdotes and so on, as we said, we've been sharing John Crawford's briefing note of the last 100 years, which puts together a lot of thoughts, a lot of comments, a lot of information. And as we said last week, love to hear comments, thoughts, memories of the sector. Please share on our socials or email us at hello@rubbishtalk.co.uk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. See you again next Thursday at 4 p.m. Don't forget to follow, share with friends, and send us your feedback at hello@rubbishtalk.co.uk.